Hi, I'm Mr. Loomis. We're going to start learning about Unit 18, which is all about times when America failed in some way. We'll start with Lesson 1, about America's involvement in the Vietnam War. Let's begin by just previewing our topics. We'll talk about why we fought in Vietnam at all, and about a law called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution that gave President Johnson the authority to send American soldiers into that war. We'll discuss the leaders in the war and the challenges those leaders faced. We will definitely talk about the anti-war movement that developed back home in America. And we'll finish by describing Vietnamization, America's plan to get out of the war, as well as the legacy or effects of the war. Let's get started. America first got involved in Vietnam early in the Cold War because we wanted to stop communists from taking over. But Vietnam was different from Korea. It was more complicated. Korea had never been a colony, but Vietnam had been part of the French colony of Indochina. After World War II ended, the French wanted to come back and retake control over their old colony. The United States was in a bad position. Americans wanted to help Vietnam become independent, but could not support Ho Chi Minh and his communist Viet Minh Army. President Harry Truman did not want to help the French continue to control Vietnam, but France was an important friend in Europe in the fight against the Soviet Union. In 1950, President Truman sent a small group of soldiers to Vietnam to help the French and gave money to help France fight the Viet Minh. But even though the Americans were helping, the French army lost in 1954. Vietnam split into North and South along the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh led the North. In the South, called the Republic of Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem took control and made himself president. He began to round up communists and friends of Ho Chi Minh. The North Vietnamese started fighting to get rid of Diem. They helped guerrilla fighters called Viet Cong attack people in South Vietnam's government. Now, the United States was afraid that Ho Chi Minh would take control of all of Vietnam and spread communism. So American leaders helped Diem's government in South Vietnam. But Diem was a bad leader. He stole money for himself. He was Catholic in a country where most people were Buddhist, and Diem attacked Buddhists. Diem also gave his family important jobs in the government and helped them get rich. Farmers, students, and Buddhists all didn't like him, and they helped the Viet Cong. The world learned about the fight between Diem and his people when Thich Nhat Hanh, a Buddhist monk, burned himself to death at a busy street on June 11, 1963. Other monks had told reporters that something important was going to happen. And photographs of his self-immolation were printed in newspapers and played on TV around the world. After Ngoc Thug died, leaders around the world told Diem to change. He promised to do things differently, but never did, which made things worse. As protests continued, the secret police working for Diem's brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, attacked Buddhists around the country. When Kennedy became president of the United States in 1961, he continued supporting Diem, just like Eisenhower had done. In 1963, the leaders of both nations were murdered. Kennedy was shot while visiting Dallas, Texas, and South Vietnamese army officers killed Diem and his brother Nhu. Diem might have been a bad leader, but after he was gone, no one was able to do a better job of leading the South. Back in the United States, Lyndon Johnson became president. Johnson was really good at getting Congress to vote for things he wanted, and in the summer of 1964, he used his talents to get Congress to vote for a new plan for Vietnam. President Johnson cared more about poverty and the environment than Vietnam, but he thought he had to keep up the idea of containment, or else the rest of the world would think America didn't care anymore about the spread of communism. In 1964, a small American ship was in the Gulf of Tonkin on the coast of Vietnam. The captain reported that he'd been attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. 2 days later, the captain said that they had been attacked again, and a second ship also said the North Vietnamese had shot at them. The North Vietnamese said the attacks never happened, and Johnson also wasn't sure if he could believe the captain's stories. Today, we know that the captains of the two ships were wrong, that the North Vietnamese never shot at the American ships. But at that time, American leaders had only the reports from the two ships. And Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara told Congress that the communists had attacked American ships. Angry, Congress voted for the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and Johnson signed it into law. Now, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave President Johnson the power to send American soldiers into Vietnam without asking Congress for a declaration of war. This was a big change. It gave the president much more power to use the Army, Navy, and Air Force. It also changed America from a supporter of South Vietnam into a major player in the war. Even though he was not the first president to send Americans to Vietnam, and he was not the president during the whole war, Americans remember the Vietnam War as Johnson's war because of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. In 1965, Johnson ordered the Air Force to begin bombing North Vietnam, and he sent American soldiers to defend the South. First, most Americans supported the president, but this started to change as more soldiers died, and the South's Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, kept losing. American General William Westmoreland asked the United States to take over leading the fight. Now, no matter how many Americans died, Westmoreland always promised we were about to win. But this was not true for many reasons. The Viet Cong did not fight the Americans in the traditional way by going to a battlefield like our enemies had in World War II in Korea. The enemy was hard to find or recognize. The Viet Cong fighters looked like regular people and liked to attack at night or lay traps for American soldiers. To separate the enemy Viet Cong fighters from regular people, the government of South Vietnam created free fire zones. All the civilians were told to leave these areas, and anyone left behind would be treated like an enemy. Attacks on civilians in free fire zones were common. American troops killed about 6,000 Vietnamese civilians during the war. Civilians are people not in the military. People who ran away from Americans were treated like Viet Cong and were killed, even though many were just regular people who were scared. We can see now that creating these free fire zones, forcing people to leave their homes and move to camps, and the way American troops acted around civilians, made many South Vietnamese people dislike the Americans. Eventually, people in the South helped the Viet Cong because they thought the Americans were worse than the communists. Since the Viet Cong would not fight normal battles, American leaders didn't know how to show that they were winning. Since they couldn't say they were winning battles or taking over land, they began to count victory by counting the number of people they killed. This meant that soldiers and army officers won awards for killing large numbers of enemy fighters. And it led American soldiers to start to attack civilians. But the most important reason America lost the Vietnam War was that the Vietnamese were fighting for independence and were willing to sacrifice and die for freedom. Vietnam was their homeland. They were not going to leave. Vietnam had been a colony of France and then was occupied by Japan during World War II. The Vietnamese people knew that the Americans would also leave if they waited long enough. It was only a matter of time. But American leaders tried their best to win. The Air Force kept up its bombing campaign for years, known as Operation Rolling Thunder. In the beginning, they attacked only military targets, but in the end attacked civilians as well, hoping to make people in North Vietnam want to give up. And the United States also attacked the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a road used by the North Vietnamese to take supplies to the Viet Cong in the south. The trail went through the countries of Laos and Cambodia, so the attacks were kept secret from Congress and the American people. America also used chemicals such as Agent Orange and napalm to clear the jungle the Viet Cong used for hiding. In all, more bombs rained down on Vietnam than the Allies used in all of World War II. In January of 1968, it was clear that Westmoreland was wrong, and America was not about to win. That was the month of Vietnamese New Year, called Tet. And the North Vietnamese started a large attack on the south. During this Tet offensive, about 100 cities in the south were attacked, including the capital of Saigon. The Americans and South Vietnamese army fought back, but many American and South Vietnamese soldiers died. Walter Cronkite, a famous news reporter who visited Saigon during the Tet offensive, said he thought America would not win the war. And it wasn't only Cronkite. Even though more North Vietnamese soldiers died than Americans, back home in the United States, people began to turn against the war. The fight in Vietnam was the first war Americans watched on television, and they didn't like what they saw. Surprise attacks like the Tet Offensive made many people think that the war would not be over soon, and a credibility gap began to develop. People in America just stopped believing what their president was telling them about the war. In the 1940s and 50s, the United States stood up to Stalin and Khrushchev in Berlin and Korea. Because of this, people around the world thought of the United States as a defender of freedom. But that changed in Vietnam. The killings of civilians horrified Vietnamese people, Americans, and the world. In Vietnam, a bad mix of power, racism, and anger infected the young men who had been sent there to fight a war they couldn't win. On March 16, 1968, about 100 American soldiers committed one of the worst crimes of the war. Led by Ernest Medina, the men were sent to attack the village of Mui Lai, where Americans thought Viet Cong fighters were hiding. No one is sure exactly what Medina told the men, but they thought he wanted them to kill everyone at Mui Lai, including women and children. The young American soldiers were stressed out. They'd been in hard fights in the past few months, and 8 of their friends had died. They were nervous about the chance of a sneak attack by the Viet Cong as they arrived at Mui Lai. When they arrived at the village, they started shooting. They set the houses on fire, and they killed the Vietnamese villagers as they ran out of the burning houses. No one ever shot at the Americans. We don't know exactly how many people the Americans killed that day, but it's somewhere between 347 and 504. None of the villagers even had a gun. The army tried to hide what had happened, and it wasn't until Congress found out about the massacre that the army took action. Finally, in 1969, the army charged 1 soldier with murder. Many Americans were horrified. Pictures of the massacre. The photos showed that they were right about the war. It was wrong. And Vietnamese people were getting hurt by Americans, not helped. Almost half of all the Americans just refused to believe that American soldiers could ever do something so bad. They wanted to think that America was involved in Vietnam for good reasons. But it was true. Americans had murdered hundreds of women and children. And killings like this were happening in other villages too. And the only soldier to ever get put on trial for the massacre spent a total of 3.5 years in house arrest. And the leaders who wanted to support the army let him go. This massacre had a huge effect on Americans and the world. The rest of the world learned that Americans could not be trusted to always do what was right. As the war went on and on, Americans heard more stories like the one that happened at Mui Lai. And they started to turn against the war. The anti-war movement grew in strength. President Nixon, who was elected in 1968, wanted to find a way to end this war, to leave Vietnam with honor, he said. He called his idea Vietnamization. He would give the South Vietnamese army equipment and training and then let them take over the fight. At the same time, he wanted to hurt the Viet Cong as much as he could, so he gave the Air Force permission to bomb Viet Cong bases in Cambodia. Cambodia is a totally separate country that had not joined the war. In 1970, Nixon also sent soldiers into Cambodia. And when he went on TV to tell people about the attacks on Cambodia, many Americans were angry. Although people had been turning against the war for years, attacking Cambodia seemed just a bad idea. Now, all young men had to register for the draft and might get called to join the army. But college students could ask for a deferment so they could finish school before having to be soldiers. Colleges were filled with smart, motivated young men who knew that after graduation there was a good chance they would have to fight in Vietnam. These students, both men and women, became the core of the anti-war movement. In 1965, the Students for a Democratic Society and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, the civil rights group, organized the first march in Washington, D.C. About 25,000 protesters came. By 1967, the anti-war movement had mixed with other social movements of the time. Many hippies of the counterculture were also part of the anti-war movement. Popular singers like Joan Baez, John Lennon, Pete Seeger recorded anti-war songs and they played at protest marches. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was against the war. Since college students could get deferments, richer white teenagers who could afford to pay for college were able to get out of the draft. But poor African Americans who did not have the money for college could not. For many of America's poor, white and black, Vietnam was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. In 1968, students at Columbia University in New York City took over the school buildings and shut down the school. They wanted the university to stop research it was doing to help the army. After 7 days, the New York police arrested 700 students, and in the fighting, 12 police officers were hurt. But the saddest protest of all happened in 1970 at Kent State University in Ohio. After violent student marches on campus, the mayor asked Ohio's governor to send in the National Guard. Soldiers came to the university where students had set fire to the ROTC building and were fighting off policemen and firemen trying to put out the fire. The National Guard used tear gas to get the students to leave, and some students were arrested. Then everything went wrong. About 1,500 to 2,000 students got together, started to throw rocks at a security guard who was telling them to leave. 77 soldiers from the National Guard came up to the students. After getting most of the students to back off, the students started to leave. And they stopped, turned, and began shooting at the students. Even today, no one really knows why. 9 students were hurt. 4 were killed. 2 of the dead had just been walking to class and hadn't even been part of the protest at all. Finally, a teacher begged the rest of the students to leave. Sadly, most of the National Guardsmen were the same age as the students, and also didn't like the idea of the Vietnam War. News of the Kent State shootings shocked students around the country. At hundreds of colleges and high schools, millions of students refused to go to class. 100,000 protesters marched in Washington, D.C. Only a few weeks later, something similar happened at Jackson State College, an African-American university in Jackson, Mississippi. Once again, students marched on campus to protest the attack on Cambodia, starting fires and throwing rocks. The police arrived and started shooting. 1 college student and a high school student were killed. Now, not everyone felt bad for the students, however. President Nixon called the student protesters bums, and construction workers attacked the New York City protesters. A survey showed that most Americans thought that violence was the students' fault. The students, African Americans and hippies, had supporters, and by the early 1970s, most Americans were against the war, but not as many people agreed with what the students were doing. Their parents and their grandparents, especially, thought the students were spoiled. They complained, they were disrespecting authority, they smoked and did drugs, they were throwing away traditions. And worst of all, the students were not supporting America's soldiers. Marches in the streets, fighting at colleges, the attacks in Cambodia made Americans unhappy about being involved in the war in Vietnam. In 1971, a poll showed that only 28% of Americans supported the war. By then, many thought the war had been a mistake. President Nixon knew that he needed to end the war, but didn't want it to look like the Americans were losing. He wanted to sign a peace deal with the North Vietnamese. Nixon's trip to China was part of his attempt to end the war in Vietnam. Because China had been supporting the communists in North Vietnam, and Nixon thought if he could build a better relationship with the communists in China, he might be able to get them to push the North Vietnamese to make peace. Americans liked what President Nixon was doing, and they liked his idea of Vietnamization. In 1973, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger signed an agreement with North Vietnam, ending America's role in the war. The United States agreed to leave Vietnam in 60 days. North Vietnam didn't have to give up anything, which meant it would be ready to attack the South with all its strength as soon as the Americans were gone. The United States left behind a small number of helpers as well as equipment, and the United States continued to send money to South Vietnam, but it was much less than before. After American soldiers left, the war kept going, but it was clear the South had no chance of winning. On the morning of April 29, 1975, as North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers arrived at the edge of Saigon, the capital of Vietnam, Americans and the South Vietnamese who had helped the United States got ready to leave. Since they could no longer get to the airport, helicopters carried Americans and Vietnamese refugees from the American embassy to ships off the coast. North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon the next day, and the South surrendered. The war had both immediate and long-term effects. With the exit of the Americans from Southeast Asia, communists took control in neighboring Cambodia and Laos. Domino theory turned out to be true in Southeast Asia. Supporters of the South Vietnamese government and those afraid of what the new communist governments might do tried to escape. Many of these refugees left Vietnam in whatever small fishing boats they could find, and they're known as the boat people. In all, more than 3 million refugees left Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Between 1975 and 1998, about 1.2 million of these refugees moved to the United States. In the longer term, the war hurt a whole generation of Americans, the baby boomers, whose parents had fought and won World War II, were left wondering what they had done wrong. Their friends had gone to die in Vietnam but had not won. What had all the death and pain before? And so it was that the generation that helped end racial segregation in the South and had done so much good for America tried to forget the war. For many years, the old soldiers and protesters never talked about what had happened. No matter how hard they tried, the wounds of Vietnam never healed. Even today, the generation of Americans who both fought the war and protested the war is not sure what to think about that terrible event in their young lives. The Constitution ended up changing because of the Vietnam War. Before the 1970s, a person had to be 21 to vote. But Americans decided that if 18-year-olds were old enough to be drafted and die for their country, they should be able to vote also. In 1971, the 26th Amendment gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. It was ratified by the necessary 2/3 of the states. It was only 3 months and 8 days after it was proposed by Congress, and that's the fastest any amendment has ever been ratified. The loss in Vietnam left its mark on the military as well. After losing in Vietnam, Americans were scared to send soldiers back into war. This was Vietnam syndrome. And it lasted into the 1980s when President Reagan finally sent the Army into action again. When President George H.W. Bush sent the military into Iraq as part of Operation Desert Storm in 1991, the people who did not like his choice were mostly people who were afraid Iraq would turn into another Vietnam. Today, a new generation of leaders are in charge in the military. They're too young to remember the loss in Vietnam. Of course, America's recent long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq bring up the painful memories of Vietnam for the generation who flew it. In all, America's war in Vietnam cost the lives of more than 1.5 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians, and over 58,000 Americans. These soldiers are honored in a touching memorial in Washington, D.C. The Vietnam Wall cuts a long V through the ground. Along its face are the names of all those who died. Visitors, many of them family and friends, come to find their loved ones' names and to leave mementos. A young architect, Maya Lin, daughter of Chinese immigrants, won a competition to plan the memorial. The design reflects the faces of those who visit. In this way, the names of the men who died are joined together with the faces of living people who come to see the Vietnam Wall, to remember a war that America lost, and a war America doesn't really know why it had to fight in the first place. Let's close with a recap of the big ideas from this sad story. First, America chose to fight in Vietnam to stop the spread of communism, but ended up fighting against people who wanted independence. Vietnam was not like previous wars. American leaders could not figure out how to win on the battlefield. In the end, Americans did so much harm that many Vietnamese people turned against them. Over time, Americans back home turned against the war, especially young people who marched in the streets and fought with police. President Nixon decided to leave Vietnam, even though he knew the South's army would not be strong enough to stop the communists from the North. The Vietnam War had an enormous impact in Southeast Asia and in the United States that affected the military, the Constitution, and the millions of people who fought, protested, had to leave their homes to escape. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time when we talk about why we don't trust our leaders to tell us the truth.